Representative Rubel, how are you?
Wonderful. Really excited to be here. I've heard amazing things about your show.
All lies, but we'll have a good time nonetheless. We are talking today. I know we're short on time, but there are a couple things I want to hit. The House Bill 40, the tax break. Everybody's been talking about this. Talk to me about this.
Yeah, I think, I actually consider myself a fiscal conservative, and that I think, we got to make sure we have money to pay the bills and meet the obligations that we need to meet. Things like funding law enforcement and fixing the roads and making sure our public schools are open and all that. At the beginning of the year, when Brad Little walked into the building and gave his State of the State address, he proposed $100 million in tax cuts. And he is not exactly a communist. I mean, he's a fiscally conservative guy, but he said, you know what? I think if we tighten our belts, we can squeeze out $100 million a year in tax cuts. Right. They come in then, Republicans in the House, led largely by Speaker Moyle, and they say, nope, we're going to quadruple that, $400 million. And over 250 of it in income tax cuts, and then 50 in property, 50 in grocery, and some other things. Sure. So, at the top line level, I'm thinking, how in the world can we lose $400 million in permanent revenue reduction? Because this is $400 million we will never have coming in again, year after year after year. It will be gone. And I suspect the governor shares my concerns, because he sure wasn't proposing a $400 million tax cut. But I think we're going to be in a pickle. I think we're in a time of economic uncertainty. We're looking at trade wars, which are really going to hit a lot of our sectors, particularly ag. We're looking at the possible deportation of 80% of our agricultural workforce if the current administration follows through on what it says it's going to do. We're looking at a lot of economic uncertainty. Growth in the state is tapering off. Things in a year from now, I think, could look very, very different than they do right now. And if we hit a downturn and we don't have the astronomical growth that they're projecting we're somehow going to keep having, I think we're going to find ourselves unable to pay our bills. I think $400 million is way too deep a revenue cut that we can't afford. And we're going to regret it, I think, in a year or two when we can't pay our bills. So at a top line level, I just don't think we can afford a king of that size. But I guess as a secondary matter...
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I had Representative Ward Angle King in last week, who sits on JFAC, and they were, at the time when I talked to her, they were in a standstill because they were arguing about the budget estimates. There was one, I think it was up across party lines, the Democrats were saying, hey, we don't agree with the budget that the Republicans were putting forth. I think the disparity was something like $300 million. And it's like, they think the budget will be $300 million. The revenue will be $300 million greater than we do. We are being conservative, so we don't if we think it's 300 million greater than it is and we're wrong, that's a real problem. If we peg the budget at X number and it actually comes in more, great, we have a surplus and we can deal with it then. But they were stuck on that. Did that get resolved in order to allow for this HB 40 to move forward?
I don't think it has. I don't think that they have actually picked a revenue number of even knowing how much money we have in the bank. But I think that the folks who are pushing for this tax cut are going for this big pie in the sky number so that they can justify a $400 million tax cut. But I'm not at all convinced that that money is really there. And I'm not convinced at all, for sure, that it's going to be there next year or the year after. Again, lots and lots of moving parts. With the state counts on $5 billion in federal money a year, and we've got a government right now that is saying they're going to completely turn off the spigot and stop all those payouts on all those grants and programs, et cetera. We could find ourselves really up the creek in the very near future. But you're right in that money is not necessarily there at all to do this cut. They're just picking this incredibly, I think, irresponsibly high number so that they can justify this income tax cut. But there's a lot of different kinds of tax cuts you can do. So Idaho collects its taxes across 3 different buckets, income tax, property tax, and sales tax. And depending on which one you cut, the benefits flow very, very differently to people of different wealth levels. So if you cut grocery tax, that pretty much helps everybody. Rich people might spend a little bit more on groceries, but it's not a very material difference. That if you cut grocery tax, that's going to go to everybody. If you go to property taxes, that's mostly going to go to everybody. It'll help people with big fancy houses a little bit more. But the most regressive thing you can possibly go after is the income tax cut. And I don't know if you've seen these numbers from the Nonpartisan Center for Fiscal Policy, but this House Bill 40 that they just passed, if you're in the top 1%, you're going to get about $5,300. If you're in the bottom 20%, you're going to get $26. So it has a staggeringly kind of reverse Robin Hood impact where all of the money goes to the people at the top and almost nothing to the people at the bottom. And they did that very deliberately. And of this, hundreds of millions of dollars they're proposing, they're putting almost all of it into the income tax piece and just, token crumbs into the grocery tax and the property tax piece. So, even if we did have $400 million lying around, which again, I'm not at all convinced we do, but there are a lot of ways that you could allocate that money, but there is no way that you could allocate it that would be more regressive than the way they're going with, where they are just showering huge amounts of money on the top 1% with almost nothing going to the people who need it.
Okay. You briefly explained where this is broken down: property tax, grocery tax, income tax. So help me understand what the different pieces were, because I think the grocery tax was a 50 million additional budget line where they're like, okay, let's increase from 125 per person to like 150 per person, and it's like 225 for an elderly person. I don't know if 65 elderly, but older person. Let's just say that. So you have 50 million going to the grocery tax. What is the relief going to the property tax?
That's another 50 million. So you got 50 toward property, 50 toward groceries, and then like almost 255 million towards income. So you're seeing 5 times more going to this income tax cut than you're seeing going toward either the grocery tax cut or the property tax piece. So they're getting really token leftover little dribbly bits, basically. And that is going to help everybody across the board. But the big chunk is going in income tax. And as I said, when you do income tax cuts, all the money meaningfully goes to the people at the top. So when you look at the breakdown of the 255 million-ish, 67% of that is going to people in the top 20%. So the biggest chunk by far, regular working people are going to see a trivial amount. As I said, $20-$30. But the multi-thousands, the $5,000 plus checks, that is going to go to the people in the top 1%. So they really found, so don't get that excited when you hear, $250 million tax cut and income taxes, because unless you're a multimillionaire, you're probably not going to see any of that.
Hey, let me tell you right now, I don't make any money from this podcast. I've been doing this for a long time now. And so when you say, hey, we're giving this 300 million, whatever the dollar number is, and you say only, you have to make X number of dollars, I don't know that I will receive any of that relief at all. So I understand what you're saying, and it affects me directly.
Yeah, well, you deserve to be paid for this great public service you're doing, but but it's,
I'm accepting checks.
Yeah. I mean, Idaho's a pretty low-income state. We have a lot of struggling people out there who are not very wealthy, and they are not going to get diddly squat from this. Yeah. And they're going to be told by their politicians, I passed a big tax cut. And, I hope they ask the next question of how much did I get versus how much did, the richest guy in the state get? Because it is going to be orders of magnitude separate. And it didn't have to be that way. They could have put this money into a grocery tax cut, sales tax cut, property tax cut, any other kind of tax cut that actually would have helped working people.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you next. If you had a magic wand and you were like, all right, I'm going to fix this one. And somebody's like, what should the dollar amount of the tax, should we have a tax cut? And if we do, how should it be distributed? What would you say?
I would say maybe the 100 million that the governor proposed. I think that's, on the conservative end. I think that would leave us in a place where we can reliably know that we can pay for police and fire and roads and bridges going forward in schools. Sure. So 100 million, and I would have gone with the 50 on grocery, 50 on property tax. I'll leave it at that. And I think that would have been the fiscally conservative, responsible thing to do that would have gotten some help to the people who need it and not done just a giant giveaway to people who frankly don't need it very much.
The property tax one gets me because I hear what you're saying about the income tax. I hear what you're saying about the grocery tax, but the property tax, just by inherently, like, you only see that if you own property, like you own the hard asset. And that knocks off a wide swath of people that are, let's say, out of their house. So they're above 18 and not quite property owners yet. Right? Like, how does that, because that to me seems like a really regressive thing, which is like, hey, to those with some, we will give more.
Well, that's a really interesting question. And you're right in that, if you own property, presumably you're doing a little bit better than most. Although there's a lot of people who have just owned, little old ladies living on Social Security who have lived in their house for decades and decades, and they're not necessarily wealthy. They just own their home, and that's pretty much their only asset.
Well, that's way more wealthy than the 19-year-old living in an apartment with $50 in his bank account.
Yeah. There's a little bit of a trickle-down theory here, and I think you're right to put your finger on this, because there's like 35% of the state who are renters. I grew up a renter. My mom was a renter. She never owned a home in her life.
Yeah, me too.
And so I'm very sensitive to the plight of renters. I'm happy now that I finally own a home, but I grew up my entire life as a renter.
And most people start out in their adult lives renting.
Yep, that's right. And I think the hope is that there's a little bit of a trickle down effect where if you cut the property taxes on the landlord, it will enable them to charge less in rent. Now, that's a big if.
That's a big if. That is a big leap right there. I don't like. I know a lot. I have a lot of friends that happen to be landlords, and they are not dropping. The rent as a property tax gets relieved.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. And that is my fundamental problem with trickle down economics is it doesn't often trickle very far. And sometimes, you're just like, oh, if we just give the rich landlord more money, I'm sure they'll pass it along in cuts to rent. Like, really? Will they? Big if. Maybe in some extent it might make them less inclined to jack up the rent. I don't think they're ever going to lower the rent. You're right.
I think they're going to take whatever the market will bear. I think that's what 100%. Every landlord is going to do.
100%. And, maybe if we had an absolutely perfect market, some landlord would say, oh, I can afford to cut, and be more competitive. But we're not in that kind of market. We have such a housing shortage. People can't get into housing at any rate, at any price point. So you are right in that would probably help. It would definitely help homeowners more. To some extent, it might obliquely help renters. But I think it would get more help to the people who need it for sure than the income tax cut will. That I can tell you with 5,000% certainty.
Gotcha. Now, when we're talking about property taxes, I've had a lot of conversations about the homeowner's exemption, the homestead exemption, however, whatever. There's an exemption for like the first $150,000 or something. And that used to be on a scale that slid more aggressively reflective of the appraised value of the home. And in recent years, it has been pegged at certain numbers. And then it's like an act of the legislature that actually jacks it up and moves it up. That to me seems like, and again, I don't know anything about it, but that to me seems like an appropriate mechanism to utilize in order to give the targeted property tax relief at the people with the lowest value homes. Like if I'm a billionaire or if I have $1 million house, I don't need theoretically, I don't need, I wouldn't mind it, but you could make the argument that somebody has $1 million house, they don't need a 50% exemption, right? But if I own, say, a $300,000 house or a $200,000 house or a $150,000 house, then I'm on the lower end of the home ownership, which helps me I get a reduced tax bill to help me get in and afford a house. And it directs the relief at the people who have the lower end of the home ownership spectrum. Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because I've heard people really be critical of this, but it's like, isn't that targeting the people that need it? They are homeowners, so they have a hard asset, but they're on the lower end of the ownership.
You are in like tax analysis. You sell yourself short. You're like, I don't know nothing about this tax stuff, but you understand things at a level that 1% of the state understand it. That was impressive.
I just listen to whatever people tell me. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Whatever.
Yeah. I mean, so again, I think there's some truth in what you're saying there. For sure, if you have a $2 million house, you don't need give them $1 million exemption.
Yeah, no, you shouldn't.
Someone's going to be paying that,
right?
Because the city budget, the county budget, they're relatively fixed. They're not allowed to go up more than 3% a year. So it costs what it costs, and let's call it $300 million or whatever to cover all of the landfill and the police.
Sure.
So then it is what it is, and it's just a question of who pays how much of it. Is more of it going to be paid by the commercial sector, by homeowner sectors, by people in big houses, by people in small houses?
Yeah.
So how you split up that pie matters. I think where there was a real pain that people felt on capping that homeowner's exemption were on those senior citizens, if you will, who bought their house in 1965 for $10,000, and they've been living it forever and ever and ever since. And now here they are, 80 years old. Their house is suddenly appraised at $600,000. They didn't do anything to it. They just sat in it and lived in it. And now all of a sudden their property tax bill like tripled overnight when that homeowner's exemption got capped. And they're like, what the heck? I'm on a fixed income. I'm on my Social Security. Now they're telling me my house is worth $700,000. I don't know. I bought it for $20,000, and all I did was sit here while the world appreciated around me. And I don't have the money to pay this. And now I am getting kicked out of my house because I don't have enough money to pay that price. And that is not an outlying scenario. I hear that a lot from people in my district, particularly seniors on fixed incomes who just, their house just appreciated under them. And now they can't pay that bill because, they lost their homeowner's exemption. So I'm sympathetic to their cause. You'd hate to, from a pure market perspective, I don't know, maybe the right answer is that they just now have to sell their house and go move into a $200,000 house, but that's not a great answer for these people.
No, I don't think it is. And I also don't think it's not binary. right? It's like if you bought your house for $10,000 40 years ago and you haven't drawn on that equity, then you have a $600,000 asset. So if your property tax bill is now $2,500 a year, you could break that up into what is that? 20, 40, you got 120 years of paying that $2,500 in equity. So like theoretically you should be able to go to like ICCU and be like, hey, can I just get an equity line of credit for like $20,000 or $25,000 so I can pay the next 10 years of property tax? I don't know these people's situation. I do hear what you're saying, which is, hey, somebody who has had this asset appreciate greatly has this big property tax bill. The flip side of that is their asset doubled in value. So to say they have no money to pay for it, it's like, well, maybe, you know, I mean, the asset doubled in value. I don't know anything about it. Like, I would actually really love, if you have a constituent nearby, I would love to talk to them. And somebody was like, hey, look, this was my tax bill. This is the problem I'm in now. Because understanding that maybe there's a place in the world where we say like, hey, if you're over, like we're doing with a grocery tax bill or a grocery rebate bill, maybe we say if you're over 65, your homeowner's exemption gets bumped up to like 300,000 or 400,000, and people under 65 have to deal with a $150,000 exemption. I don't know. Yeah. But like, that seems like it would go more in line with a targeted problem, which everyone says is the elderly people that are on fixed incomes.
And you're right. And it's a very nuanced question because you have some elderly people on fixed incomes who are really struggling to make ends meet on their Social Security checks. I also know some incredibly wealthy people over 65 who are
God bless them.
Multi-millionaires who, you know, and so it's when you just said it at age, it's always hard to get the help to the right people and only the right people.
You just said it though. Let's do age and income cap.
Age and income. You could probably do it with a hybrid of age and income.
Age and income, we hit the exact, if you make under $40,000 and you're over the age of 65, you get a $400,000 tax exemption or a property tax exemption. We just solved the problem. I think we just did it. Like, can we just call it a day and go get like a drink? Yeah, maybe not going to pass. One other question, because again, I know we don't have that much more time. Staying on property tax, when we have problems between commercial versus residential, because we've had an inversion of like who's paying the bulk of the property tax. Because when we had the homeowner's exemption, it used to be that commercial real estate was paying more and residential real estate was paying less, and now it's inverted. There are a lot of factors that go into that. For instance, the astronomical number of residential roofs that have popped up in the last, I don't know, 10 years, things of that nature. But we did also theoretically cap the exemption that residential property owners got, right? Not theoretically, we did do that. Yeah. At the same time, we're reliant on these commercial institutions like, you know, hospitals and whatnot to supply what's already unaffordable, which is healthcare, right? So if we start increasing the burden of our taxes, property tax back onto commercial, that's going to be a direct hit across the board, like a sales tax to everyone, because everybody has to use, you know, health insurance. And obviously you have people that are engaging in health insurance more when they're elderly. So it's almost like a regressive tax towards the elderly. Am I understanding that correctly? Because if the hospital units have to pass on that tax burden to their customers, and we know that people that spend the most money, like per capita, per, you know, whatever, are people older, like, is that a concern, or am I not understanding that one correctly?
Well, a lot of them are on Medicare. So a lot of them are fortunate in that they're not necessarily picking up the tabs on that increased cost. But
the increased cost for Medicare would not get passed on. Like, that would get passed on to the paying customers because we have a cap and reimbursement with Medicare, right?
Yes. That's the doctors who eat that, though. The consumer generally is covered. There is so much that goes into the cost of healthcare. I'm guessing that the property tax piece is a really, really small sliver of the pie. I think the much bigger piece is going to be, say, Medicaid expansion. If we had Medicaid expansion, that is going to really upend the world of financing healthcare. If all of a sudden you suck $1 billion of federal money out of the healthcare system that is flowing into Idaho right now, and you suddenly throw 100,000 plus totally uninsured people onto the doorsteps of hospitals because they have to treat them when they show up. They can't turn them away by federal law. So that is going to really jack with the cost structure. If you suddenly, particularly in rural areas where you might have, 40, 50% of the population is pretty poor and would be uninsured without Medicaid expansion. And all of a sudden you tell the hospitals, like, I'm sorry, but now 50% of the people turning up on your doorstep are going to be uninsured. You have to just eat that cost and pass it along to other people. That's going to really turn the world of funding upside down, I think, far more than the little adjustments that you would see with the amount of the homeowner's exemption.
Medicaid, obviously, wading into this problem is then we have to start looking at ballot initiatives too, right? Because we got the Medicaid expansion as a ballot initiative. It was something that the populace very much wanted. And if we axe that, like, not only did they want it when it was like a $4 million, or like it was roughly a $400 million total cost, because the initial budget towards the Idaho taxpayer was $40 million. And it has since gone up to essentially $1 billion, and Idaho's portion of it is $100 million. But this is something that people wanted. And it's the ability for us to effectively represent ourselves in a legislative manner, which is the ballot initiative, for better or for worse, right? Like, and, you know, Medicaid expansion worked, right? Excuse me. Medicaid expansion was passed by the populace. That worked. Yeah. Prop 1 was rejected by the populace. That worked as well. There's no scenario where a ballot initiative passes or fails and the system didn't work. It only, like, we participated collectively and we got an answer collectively.
Agreed. And I am really, really concerned at all of the attacks on ballot initiatives happening right now. And I think you actually see a pretty major disconnect between what the people of Idaho want and what they get from their legislature.
What do you mean? Explain that to me.
Oh, goodness. There was a great survey that the BSU School of Public Policy just put out that's very balanced, that's geographically balanced. It's majority Republicans, majority conservative people responding, because that's what the state is made up of.
That's what the population is, yeah.
And it's and you look at what is on that list versus what happens legislatively, it's almost like a photo negative. It's almost like the opposite of what people want is what they get from the legislature. But you look at it, their top concerns are funding public schools, funding affordable housing. I mean, like, near the bottom of the list was vouchers. And yet that is kind of what's sucking up all the oxygen in the room. It was like 14% of the population actually wanted that. And in comes the legislature saying, number one thing we got to do is vouchers. Across you name it. I mean, abortion. A majority of Idahoans actually favor it to be legal through first term. A vast majority support health exceptions. Can't get a health exception for your life through this legislature. But you see, a majority of people for a long time wanted Medicaid expansion. And for 7 years, the legislature flatly refused to even allow a vote on it. And so really, the ballot initiative is the only thing the people of Idaho have. It's their only break the emergency glass option to do something when they really, really, really want it. And their politicians will not deliver it no matter what. I think there are actually a lot more things that people want that the legislature is not delivering. But it's a huge hurdle to get a ballot initiative through. I mean, it has to be like a super hair on fire emergency for people to get out there and, volunteer by the thousands and knock doors and stand all day in farmers markets collecting signatures. I think there are a lot of things, that maybe people really want, but that don't rise to the level of being willing to kill themselves for a year collecting signatures and begging and knocking doors. But to take away the one thing they have, as difficult as it is to carry through, and it's super hard to get a ballot initiative passed in Idaho. So it's really only those really extreme circumstances where people want something very badly and the legislature is just stuffing them in their face on it. But to take away that one sliver of hope that people have to get something passed when their legislature won't is crazy. But we have, I don't know how many bills going through the legislature right now that would effectively squash that ballot initiative, right?
Okay, listen, you and I got thrown into this conversation a little bit late. Time is crunched. I have so many damn questions for you. But we gotta, will you please come back? Can we just get something scheduled right now? Because I want to talk 100%. More about property tax. I want to talk about ballot initiatives. I want to talk about a dump truck of things. Thank you for coming in today. Thank you for just, jumping on for a quick conversation here. Is there anything you want to say at the end here?
I am so excited you're running this. I think the biggest problem that we have in this world is lack of civic knowledge and understanding of these complex issues. And I love that you're shining a light on it, and I will come back anytime.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Thank you for coming in, and we'll do it again in like a week or two.